Welcome to our UK-Australia Free Trade Agreement webinar. As we're going through, if everybody could be on mute, that would be great. My name is Mark Ayres, I'm a partner at BDO. Our running order today is an introduction from DIT, two talks from BDO clients giving their experience of the Australian marketplace, then time for questions at the end. So please submit questions throughout the webinar to the panelists via the chat, and we'll answer as many as possible. Any questions we don't get to, we'll answer post the webinar. A follow-up note. Now let's get started. I'll hand over to Joe Freeman and Vivian Life.
Hi, thanks, Mark. Good morning, everybody. My name is Joe Freeman, and I am the Consul General for Queensland and Northern Territory for the Department for International Trade. I've been in this role 18 months. I was previously Deputy Consul General in Sydney, and I arrived here in October 2019 to head up the UK consulate in Queensland. My role is, there's three parts to my role. I'm the UK government's representative in Queensland and Northern Territory. And to give you an idea of the scale of the patch that I cover, the UK would fit into Queensland 7 times over. We have a GDP the same size as New Zealand and a population of around 5 million people. So it's a big patch to cover. And the first thing that I do is engage both politically, economically, and on the public diplomacy side. So the kind of public face of the UK government here in Queensland. The second part of my role, which is Director of International Trade for the Department for International Trade, I focus primarily on supporting UK companies who want to export or do business here in Australia, not just in Queensland, but Australia as a whole. And we work across 4 key sectors with my teams based in Perth, Brisbane, Melbourne, Sydney and Canberra. And those sectors are financial professional services, particularly fintech, the defence sector, technology across all aspects of technology. And one of the things that we were talking about earlier is the emerging tech scene, not just in the main hotspots of Sydney and Melbourne, but also here in Queensland as well. And then infrastructure, which is of course a huge sector for the UK here in Australia. We also work across consumer, retail, creative, and obviously food and drink. And you've seen the advert, when the free trade agreement and negotiations were launched, Boris Johnson holding up a packet of Tim Tams and saying, you give us penguins, we'll give you penguins, you give us Tim Tams, which caused a huge amount of debate here in the office in Brisbane, and in fact led to us eating a lot of Tim Tams, a lot of penguins, just to compare and contrast, you understand. The third thing that I do in my role is on the consular prevention side. So it's around keeping our British travellers and residents and itinerant workers safe while they're here in Queensland. And we work with the emergency services and several agencies in order to be able to do that. So there's 3 distinct parts of my role. I'll hand over in a moment to Vivian, who is our chief negotiator for the FTA with Australia and New Zealand. But I just first want to outline a little bit about what DIT does here in Australia to support companies across the piece, but also to leave you with some kind of top tips that we found work for companies when they're first looking at this market, because as you can imagine, interest has boomed since we started the launch of the talks. So UK and Australia have a long history of trade and investment and a long and strong relationship together. The UK is the 2nd largest investor here. Australia is the 2nd largest investor in the UK. 1.2 British nationals call Australia home, which is the largest expat population outside of Europe. We have a team across Australia working across all sectors to support UK companies who not just want to export here, but for Australian companies who want to set up into the UK. We have around 35 staff across our posts in Australia. And we can support you through all aspects of that export journey. And I'm delighted that one of the companies that we have supported, Cubital, is going to be talking to you a bit later on, and hopefully can say nice things about the work that we did with them. But for me, I think the things that I would leave you with, if you're looking at doing business here and are serious about doing business here is the first thing: do your research. There's a wealth of information out there that is available to you either through DIT or through organisations like Austrade, through our partners with at BDO, through Trade Investment Queensland and other state-based organisations. There's a whole host of information there that you can have that's freely available. Have a strategy for your export or your investment. Be clear about what your motivation is for wanting to enter this market. It's a very sophisticated market. So if you do your research, that shows, and it is appreciated when you're talking to partners here. Be flexible about your plans, be flexible about your travel. At the moment, there is no international travel apart from returning Australian citizens into Australia, and that's likely to remain in place for at least another 6 to 8 months. As we've seen with our colleagues in Melbourne and Sydney, the situation here around COVID changes rapidly and state borders close suddenly and sometimes with very little notice or warning. So be flexible, have a contingency plan if you're planning to travel here over the next, well, after the lockdown is lifted here. There's lots of support available. International trade teams across the UK that work with DIT can support you on the ground, can give you advice, can give you support and share their skills, their knowledge and their expertise. We all work in partnership together. We want you to have the best experience you can when you're working with us. So please do get in touch with me or any of my colleagues from DIT that are on the call today, and we will see what we can do to make your export or your investment journey that much better. I'd like to hand over now to, or introduce you to Vivian Leith, who is our Chief Negotiator for Australia and New Zealand, to share with you some information that she has around the negotiations and to introduce her role in making this happen. Thank you.
Hi, Vivian, I think you're on mute.
Classic error, which you would have thought one would have learnt not to do after a year of this. Let me start again. So, hello, I'm Vivian Leith. I'm the Chief Negotiator for Australia. I have a colleague, Matt Davis, who's the Chief Negotiator for New Zealand, because although I kept a close eye on New Zealand for a while, now the negotiations are well underway. We need a negotiator in charge of each. It's good to be sharing a platform with Joe. Joe and I first met when I went to Sydney in December 2016 at the start of the journey that set these negotiations in train. And it's very exciting that they're now very much well underway. I think the first thing I will say before I talk about the negotiations themselves is do not wait for these negotiations to conclude if you're interested in trading with Australia, that we have two pretty open economies with a very successful two-way trade and investment relationship already. The attraction of this FTA is it enables us to build and enhance that. And we're certainly looking to do that in ways that make business and investment flow even better. But one of the rationales for Australia being one of the very first negotiations that we undertook was the strength of that relationship that was already in place. We wanted the first UK FTA, which this could be, or the early UK FTAs, to be with advanced countries who share our outlook, where we could set a really good standard of agreement as we move into the UK's independent trade policy and negotiate new free trade agreements across the world. And I will just pause a moment to say today sees the publication of the UK's integrated foreign policy and defence review. But that is not just about foreign policy and defence, it's about the UK's approach to the world. And embedded in that is what people are calling an Indo-Pacific tilt, but basically means an increased focus on this region and places like Australia. So doing an FTA with Australia is also part of that vision of expanding the UK's relationships across the world as we come out of the EU. In terms of where we are with this negotiation, we launched them in June last year. Sadly, because of the travel restrictions that Joe has reminded you about, we have been doing the negotiations entirely virtually. And we have had 4 rounds of negotiation, gradually working our way through the objectives we have in terms of the rules that can be improved in terms of trade between us, and the way in which we open up our markets to each other in both goods and services. So in terms of what we're actually trying to do, I'm talking in very general terms because I don't know how familiar people are with FTAs. We can talk about that a bit more later, but we're looking at facilitating trading in services and investment, which is, how do you regulate your services? How do you regulate your investment? How do you make it more open, more possible for investment to flow in both directions and be protected once it's there? We're looking at removing tariffs and other trade barriers in goods. Australia is an open economy, but there are 5% tariffs across quite a lot of products in Australia. The UK has definitely got more tariffs set at 0, but we've still got some higher protections around more sensitive areas like agriculture. We're looking at how we can together reduce those barriers and make trade more open towards us. We're looking at different aspects of how you conduct trade in services. Those of you who are services providers will know sometimes it's done across borders, sometimes it's done by sending people. So is it investment? Is it movement of people? We're trying to cover all the aspects by which services trade is conducted, make it more certain by making definitive commitments to each other in the rules that will enable that trade to go forward. We're trying to be as transparent and engaging with business as much as we can as we go through these negotiations. We had always, of course, had trade deals that UK businesses could benefit from through the EU, but as we do this independently, we've really stepped up the extent to which we engage with businesses as we develop our policy, and we'll be keen to work really closely with businesses once the agreement is in place to make sure it really gives a boost to trade across the piece. As Jo said in her opening remarks, having this prospect of an FTA has piqued people's interest in trade with Australia. And what we saw when the EU did a deal with Korea, for instance, was trade went up right across the piece, not just in the things that have been affected by the FTA, but in general, because of the increased awareness of each other's markets that having the FTA in place had made. So what we've been doing with Japan, where we concluded a deal at the end of last year, one that mainly replicated the EU, but had some UK-shaped elements to it in becoming the UK-Japan deal, is we've put a lot of effort into trade missions and awareness raising, using the fact of the FTA as at the center of that. And there are definitely elements of trade that will be better as a result of that FTA, but more generally wanting to exploit it to help trade and investment flow in both directions. So very keen to keep working with businesses as we go forward. If there are barriers that you have come across in trading with Australia, we continue to be interested in those, or any interest that you have in this FTA, you can get in touch with us direct. Our email address is anzengagement@trade.gov.uk. But I'll leave it at that for now and hand back to our hosts. But thank you very much for having me and the opportunity to give you this broad picture of where we are on the FTA at the moment. Thanks very much.
Brilliant, Vivian, thank you very much. And a load of content in there, which is really helpful. Just to keep things moving, a very brief mention to people, if you do have questions, do pop them in, and we will get a chance to answer a couple of those at the end, but anything else we'll be able to take through to the DIT as well for conversation, so do pop the questions in. Actually going to hand over very quickly now to our first business that's going to just talk a bit about their experiences and the value of trading with Australia. So really pleased to hand over to Gordon Oliver, who's the Group Finance Director of Jones Halstead, which is AIM-listed manufacturing business in the UK, but still has a lot of those strong family values as well from its heritage, and also historically winner of the Queen's Award for Innovation and for International Trade as well. So Gordon, over to you. Thank you.
Hi there, thanks Mark. I mean, we as a company have been manufacturing in Manchester for about 105 years, and our history is textiles. Today, we're not involved in textiles, we're involved in commercial vinyl flooring. But that history in textiles ran through till about 2000, and our first involvement in Australia would be from the 1940s onwards, supplying Australia with motorcycle jackets produced in Stoke-on-Trent. And that led to our second involvement in Australia by taking on board an Australian brand, Riserbone, which sort of went with the waxed cotton of motorcycle, but took it more country wear. In the 60s, we started to bring flooring into Australia, in fact, set up a manufacturing plant in Australia, which probably ran there for about 6 or 7 years. But as investment got bigger and bigger in flooring, we brought all our manufacturing back to Manchester to have a single factory. So we've manufactured in Australia and we've sold to Australia in 3 or 4 different markets. I mean, in the case of the Riserbone brand, I mean, it was an Australian icon at one time. I don't know where it stands today, but we took that on board back in the late 80s, shortly after the Olympics of 1988, where Australia, it sort of coincided with shortly after their bicentennial, and there became a lot of interest in Australia in itself. And that brand, I think we helped to take worldwide. And it was a very interesting experience exporting from Australia, because you tend not to think of Australia as an exporter of anything other than, you know, raw materials and agriculture, but it's a good base for manufacturing. The flooring side has really come to the fore in the last 30 years, where now we are exclusively flooring in Australia. And we operate with a warehouse in every state, including Tasmania. We probably employ, I think, close to 100 people. We do something like $85 million worth of turnover in commercial flooring. So it's a lot of flooring going there, from hospitals, schools, prisons, even into the domestic front. I mean, we're supplying the big domestic chains like Carpet Choice and Carpet Court, because though we don't sell domestic flooring, these outlets are really doing all the little commercial jobs across Australia, whether it be a classroom or a home office. So it's big business to us, and it's very important. And in terms of how we got there, because I think I've been involved in Australia for 30 years, visited it many times, but at its simplest level, you've got to know the market. I mean, it's we all in England think we know Australia, but you know, what have we really seen? You know, Crocodile Dundee and a bit of Steve Irwin. I mean, it's a very English environment in terms of the language, the culture, and the history, but very different. And I would say that the first thing when you're selling to Australia, and the first stage is usually distance selling, exporting into Australia. The first thing to remember is price in the local currency. That was a very strong view we've taken for many years, and many export companies in the UK price in sterling. Well, the problem with that is the exchange rate goes up and down, and the customer's making the buy decision or not. I mean, if you're pricing in currency, you know, every time you take an order, you're looking at that margin and thinking, what can I do about it? And I think it's one of the keys to our success. So around the world, any market, we sell in their local currency, create a price list, and stick with those prices for a period of time. the other important thing with it going to Australia is check the duty rates, as previous speaker said. I mean, the 5% seems to be there across the board. But equally, that in our market, we've managed to talk with the Australian representatives and remove duties, because the duties that exist, by and large, are to protect local manufacturers. And in our industry, there are no local manufacturers left. So, you know, there is no good reason for the duties. It's a slow process, but, you know, probably of what we take into Australia now, probably 50% still attracts duty and 50% doesn't. The other thing to remember about Australia, the geographic size of the place. I mean, selling into one city, it's huge. You know, it's 6-7 hour flights to cross from one side to the other, and really it's a federal government system. So really you are dealing with different states and the big distances. So you open up a warehouse in Sydney, you've got huge transport costs to get the product to Perth, or less so Brisbane and Melbourne, but still it's a challenging market, and transport internally is a big issue. So that's another feature of the marketplace that we found it. And in doing business in Australia, and we made many mistakes in the early days, and one of those mistakes has tended to be sending your key manager from the UK to go to Australia and try and run Australia as if it was, you know, part of the UK. And these days, when we're in a market, it's absolutely certain that our head man, our head salesman, is going to be a local. He's not going to be an expat. He's going to be Australian, and in New Zealand, a New Zealander, because you need to understand the local market and how business is done. And that's worked very well for us, but always in conjunction with a strong finance function. We've learned over the years that having an MD where the FD reports to him can be a recipe for disaster. So we always work this dual reporting. FDs report to FDs, MDs report to MDs. And our MDs are almost always from a sales background rather than any other background, because at the end of the day, that's what the market is for, sales. But when I think back and think, you know, what were the things that you would like to have known then that you've learned through by history? There's a few things come out of it. I mean, know your market, so go there, understand it, be there. Work with, and the two parties I would say that can be of great use in moving into Australia or any market. One is your local Chamber of Commerce, a very underrated body in the UK, but they've got a tremendous amount of knowledge on how to move things, what the deal is in moving to places, and they can put you in close contacts with the DIT and you know, foreign embassies and trade missions, and they can be very useful. They were extremely useful to us in our early days in many markets, and continue to be a source of great advice. They know the ropes. They've crossed the bridge before, and they can put you in touch with people who are in the same boat as you. The other thing that I wish I'd known about Australia is never underestimate the mates culture. I mean, it's a strange thing. I mean, people tend to want to do business with their mates in Australia. It's not a much smaller country than us, but the connections are very personal and very deep. I mean, it's not I don't mean it in a corrupt way. It's, you know, people want to do business with their mates. And we've got some very strong relationships built over time that have come from the most odd places, you know, whether it be the golf course or a fishing trip. And they are professional relationships, but they go beyond, you know, 9 to 5. And that seems to be much more of an issue in Australia. I mean, whether that's because it's a friendlier country, whether that's because they're more social, I can't tell you. But it's definitely a feature of life. And of course, you know, that involves sport. I mean, you can't do anything in Australia without talking rubbish about sport. A very strange situation. But there are some key relationships as well that you need to forge when you're doing business in Australia beyond the distance selling. And those relationships are, you know, well, number one would be your freight forwarder. To move the product from A to B, you need a very, very good freight forwarder, and they ain't necessarily the biggest ones. I mean, and we're moving heavy product all that way, and it can be very expensive, and it can be very fraught with challenges. And the freight forwarder is a key relationship. You know, most of our goods move to Australia on refrigerated containers that are returning empty to Australia, and we find that suits the product better. They're far more carefully looked at than general containers because they are expensive and they're cheap. But the people who are doing freight on the reefers are very fussy about who they use to go back with. Another key relationship is the audit firm. And I've found great difficulty over many years in getting any form of continuity with the larger accounting firms. I mean, Brisbane, I had Arthur Anderson, Ernst & Young, Deloitte, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and I never had any continuity because the staff were always moving on, not just the junior staff, not just the managers, the partners. And it almost seemed in Brisbane, it's like, why am I here? I want to be in Melbourne or Sydney, or more correctly, in Europe. You know, the young accountants don't want to be there. And so for many, many years, we've always gone with the smaller firms, you know, the PKFs, the Burt Camerons, to get a degree of continuity at any level, whether it be the manager or partner, and to get away from the staff really. You know, we're doing warehousing and distribution, and the younger staff want to be into media, they want to be into fashion brands, they want to be into technology, and basically they want to be in Europe. Because they have this idea that that's the future, going to have 4 or 5 years in London. And so it forges that relationship with an audit firm, because you're going to need them. You're going to need them because they'll be your link to your bank, they'll be your link to staying straight with the tax man, and it's a good relationship to have.
Yeah. And Gordon, I'm just aware with time they just kind of fit in everything else we've got. But, you know, I love the call out for the audit firm. We've actually worked with you for a long time. We were a PKF and then obviously moved into becoming BDO, and have enjoyed a very good relationship with you. So thank you for the mention there. I think at that point, I will hand over now to Bill. And Gordon, thank you very much for your contribution there. So Bill, can I hand over there to you?
Thank you very much, Mark. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce Mr. Peter Sprzinski, who is the country manager for Cubital, and Cubital is a UK business that has set up in Australia. Peter, may I ask you to outline, I suppose, the journey of Cubital and some of the bumps in the road that you've experienced?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Good morning, good evening, everyone. So yes, by way of background, my name's Peter Sprzinski. I head up the Cubital organisation, which is the Australian outpost, if you like, for Vanguard Healthcare, which is an organisation that has been working in the UK predominantly with the NHS for more than 21 years now. And Cubital was established in March of 2019. It was likely after there was some funding challenges with the NHS in the UK, and Vanguard decided to look for a counterpoint economically as an alternative economy to be able to help manage the peaks and troughs that they were encountering in the UK market. What we do is deliver temporary hospital facilities, and that's fully fitted out operating theatres that literally get delivered on the back of a truck, or recovery wards or decontamination facilities, and they're bigger than normal shipping containers, but and then they sort of open up like spaceship sideways and have everything inside them. and very commonplace in the UK. As I said, it's been operating there for many, many years. And when you speak to the Australian customers, there's this light bulb moment every time as to why hasn't anyone thought of that here? And so therefore the market for Australia here is, for this solution is very, very ripe. There's been fraught with a range of challenges. The protective nature of Australia is something to have to come to terms with and overcome. So we deal with 3 tiers of government. At every delivery and installation, we have to get local council permission to erect or deliver our facility. Have to have state government approvals through fire regulations and other sort of compliances, and then national compliances from a healthcare standard, a variety of healthcare standards. So dealing with all of those and making sure that we can adapt everything that may have been assembled in the UK, that may have been not procured in Australia, may not have an Australian watermark for a plumbing tool, or for the HEPA filters may not be to an Australian standard, but maybe to a UK or an EU standard, or even an international standard. But it doesn't have the AU standard compliance, and then that sometimes involves a little bit of extra effort in terms of having the right consultants who can act on your behalf to assist in translating those kinds of standards. One thing very, very important in terms of trying to penetrate the market, trying to introduce something of our scale at least, we relied on DIT immensely. So much so that the bulk, or the current operational income for us from our current projects that are running, where we've got our facilities installed, all have been introduced to us by the UK Department of International Trade. The most interesting challenge, though, is when the market probably takes a little bit more of an extreme protectionist approach in the tariff exemption process. And in that sense, people like Bill, not people like Bill, Bill specifically in our case, have helped us navigate that really challenging space. Product definition, so defining what it is that you want to actually import. And you have to really define it to the nth degree, and describing that where it is unique and what is niche about it. And that burden of proof can sometimes be a little bit tricky. We need to sometimes go a few more layers deeper than you would originally expect in sort of describing what it is that's unique about a particular offering or import. The other challenge is that while the standards are actually almost identical in the UK or in the EU prior to Brexit, but the Australian standards are very similar, but they're not often reciprocally recognised. So when we talk about an electrical standard, we all work on 240 volts, for example, but the requirements for certification are a little bit different. There's just a few little idiosyncrasies that the Australian facilities require that the UK may interpret differently. And therefore proving that a piece of equipment is actually that you want to import, and to date we have been predominantly importing equipment that's been built in the UK or at least overseas, largely because we're still looking to establish that manufacturing in Australia. A lot of that equipment has been built to a UK or an EU standard, and proving that while it's in transit, or even once it's installed, or once it's delivered into the country, before it actually goes out to the customer, that it actually is compliant with an Australian standard from a construction perspective, from an electrical perspective, or safety, fire safety perspective. All of those can be challenging and needs some really strong support and insight to help guide you through that. And that's where we see the likes of BDO being very, very helpful in that. I think Joe's advice early on to do your research is really important. Market research to one of the challenges in importing something and trying to get a tariff exemption is to show through market research that there is a lack of local skill or competency or current capability. And that's quite exhaustive. Look, on one side, it makes sense. It protects the national interests. But on the other hand, makes it difficult. As I said earlier, we're trying to bring in equipment and facilities, our units, so that we can teach companies, partner companies, contractors to build locally. But to even bring those in under and to establish that competency in Australia, we still needed to go through all those hoops, and that's proven to be a lot of work. Not certainly impossible, but just a lot of work. And so therefore, looking for partners with the right experience has proven to be a really, really fruitful exercise, and investing the time in getting the right partners on board has proven to be very, very important.
Peter, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm just conscious of the glassy eyes of my colleagues around timing.
Sure.
You've raised some very rich issues around tariffs, technical barriers to trade, and just general establishment. And I think that will certainly enrich future conversations. And I thank you very much for that. I'll pass over to you, Mark.
So I believe we're now at question time. So if I could probably kick off with, it's probably a question for Vivian and Joe. So what do you see as some of the key opportunities likely to come from a successful free trade agreement, and what's the biggest challenges in securing a free trade agreement?
I think Joe would expect me to go first on that one. So I think I sort of talked about it in headline terms in my introductory remarks, but I would say it was really interesting listening to the experiences of people doing business. There is if you take the business of standards, there is a whole section of what we negotiate about, which is called technical barriers to trade, where we look at precisely all those kind of regulatory issues. We're not in a world where we're going to adopt each of the standards, but there are approaches you can take to how that testing is done that can be facilitated for a free trade agreement. So that's one sort of nitty-gritty sort of practical area. Other areas that we really do hope to make a difference in include on business people moving. It was interesting also to hear experiences of, do you bring a UK person out or do you hire locally in terms of those leadership and management roles? We would certainly want to be able to make firmer commitments about how our visa regimes work in such a way that would give more certainty for businesses wanting to move people. Those are a couple of areas. In the area of standards, we're also talking particularly about what are called sanitary and phytosanitary arrangements, which govern trade in agriculture. We're both two countries with very strict standards that we're very proud of, and keen to defend, and also a part of our brands when we export. But are there ways in which we can make complying with those standards in either country more straightforward? We're looking at also at how do we make sure that this FTA facilitates trade in the things that are growing between Australia and New Zealand? Jo and her colleagues are doing a lot in the financial services space. So there's already a fintech bridge. We've got digital chapters and a financial services chapter. Bringing those together, and the work that we do there should help enhance that area of cooperation. We are looking at what we can do to make sure that we're not doing anything that's getting in the way of innovation, and trying to find ways that down the track we can keep that FTA up to date, such that if things change in how trade is done, the rules are still relevant to that. I could go on, but I'm conscious of our limited time. That was sort of some core reflections plus some sort of prompted by what I was hearing about people's lived experience of trading and investing with Australia. Just a glimpse is what I would say. You'll have to give me back for an hour to do it more justice.
Hi, Joe, have you got any further comments to make?
I would just, I think, pick up on the question around challenges. What are some of the challenges that we are seeing? I think it's for us on kind of this side, looking at UK companies that want to come here, it's about managing their expectations. You know, we've all dealt with companies that are really keen, really enthusiastic, and as Vivian said earlier, this is a hook for people to look at Australia. As we've already seen, inquiries are going up, but it's a challenging market if you're not fully prepared. And Gordon made the point, you know your market. It's a different market from the UK. Quite a lot of the conversations that me and my team are having with companies who, you know, there's great enthusiasm, which is absolutely right, around what the FTA will bring. But sometimes, you know, we have to be the voice of reason and say this is perhaps not the right market for some companies. And have to kind of say no, which is as valuable as saying yes, because ultimately it saves them a lot of time, a lot of money, and you know, and reputation sometimes in this market. So I'd say we face challenges around managing expectations. We face challenges around creating the wrong sorts of expectations, and just say the advice that Gordon and Peter have got to give is absolutely invaluable. Those guys have done it. They know what the pitfalls are. So please take the advice that's offered. Thank you.
That's great. So conscious of time, so any questions that you do have, please do feel free to submit those to us directly, and we'll come back to you after the webinar. I believe we now can move on to some quick polling questions. So at the bottom of your screen, there's a poll tab. So the first question is, do you see trade or investment opportunity within the UK-Australia corridor for economic growth? So could you submit your poll answer now? I'm hoping there's a lot of 100% here. And as those votes are going through, I'll go through the second question because you can see them both. When are you looking to trade or invest in the Australian market? As those votes are tumbling in, it looks kind of what we might have expected, seeing you've come to this webinar, and you're keen to explore this opportunity, and you're looking to do it quickly. So that's positive news. So I believe that brings us to the close of the webinar. We've run over slightly. So the next session is a roundtable discussion on the free trade agreement negotiations, and this is where fingers crossed, the technology works. And for those guys that are participating, please don't leave the call, as you will be automatically transferred. So if we could start that process now, and for everybody else who's joined the call, just leaves me to say thank you very much for joining us, and it's been a pleasure giving this presentation to you. And any questions or any feedback, please do pass it on. Thank you very much.